Spotlight, lectures and performances on and around Albany State University.
Now, I'm not going to stand here and read all this information to you because we know who this fella is that's visiting us tonight. We all know him. He's a homeboy. And he grew up with some of us, and some of the younger people will get to know him tonight, and that's why he is here. We are so proud and so honored to have this distinguished, inspiring, very wise man with us. So if you want to know all about what he's done, read those 3 or 4 pages we've given you. You know that he's very successful, very humble man, and God has been good to him. Now he's going to come and talk to us and tell us whatever he wants to tell us. I present to you the Honorable Judge Herbert Phipps.
Thank you very much. It is very good to be home. And as has been said, many of you here have known me a long time, and I'm proud and honored that you would take the time to come here this evening. And those of you who don't know me, I hope that after this evening you will know me a lot better, and hope that I may say something that will inspire some of the young people to dedicate their lives to the kinds of things that were done by many of the people who are honored in this Civil Rights Museum. You know, I see so many friends here. I see my great friend James Griffin, and when I saw him, I was reminded recently a friend of mine was talking to a great friend of his, and she was talking about her husband, and he asked her, he said, well, you know, if your husband dies before you do, how long would you wait to remarry? And she answered, that depends on whether I bury him in the morning or the afternoon. You know, I'd like to go, before I go on, I'd like to introduce my wife, Connie, who's here. Would you please stand? And her mother, my mother-in-law, who's here, Miss Lucille Curry. And Connie and I have been married 41 years. You know, I heard another lady talking recently about a long marriage, and they asked her what was the secret to her long marriage, and she said, well, whenever he makes me angry, I just clean every toilet in the house. And then somebody asked, well, how does that help you? And she said, well, I use his toothbrush. I'm going to talk to you a while this afternoon, and after I finish, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. I'm going to try to give you some insight into who I am and what was going on in my mind in my early years, and the kind of things that led me to where I am today. I said, most of you, as I said, I've known a long time, but sometimes you know people and you don't really know what's going on in their minds or what's having an impact on them. I'm now serving on the Georgia Court of Appeals. The Georgia Court of Appeals sits in Atlanta. We have 12 judges, and we usually sit in panels of 3. If those 3 can agree, then the other 9 don't get involved. But if there's a disagreement among those 3, and there often is, then it'll roll over to at least 7 and sometimes 12, depending on the circumstances. And we have statewide jurisdiction in the state of Georgia. I was appointed to the court in '99 by Governor Roy Barnes, was elected statewide in 2000, again statewide in 2006, and I'm on the ballot this year in 2012 for another 6-year term. At the Court of Appeals, we hear cases from all over the state of Georgia. We hear anywhere from 3,000 to 3,500 cases a year. And per capita, we are said to be the busiest Court of Appeals in the United States. Georgia has about 10 million population. And to help you put that in perspective, we have 12 judges hearing the appeals from all over the state, and the Court of Appeals of Georgia hears 87% of every appeal that's made in the state of Georgia. And for example, as I said, Georgia has about 10 million population. Louisiana has about 3 million population. We have 12 judges in the Court of Appeals. Louisiana has about 62. And they're split up into districts like our congressional districts, and the judges just hear cases from the district. Florida is split up into districts. And Alabama has a civil court of appeals and a criminal court of appeals, but our Court of Appeals hears everything, civil and criminal. And what we do, we hear cases based on the record that was made down below, the record that was made in the trial court. We don't have witnesses come up and testify. We don't have jurors. The judges receive the record. You know, when you go to court, you see the court reporter preparing the record. And that record of the trial and everything that happened prior to the trial, the hearing, comes up to us. And we look at that to determine whether the person who made the appeal or the entity, it may be an individual or corporation or some other entity appealing, whether they are entitled to a new trial or some other relief. Now, each judge on the Court of Appeals has 3 staff attorneys assisting him or her. You know, there are 2 black judges on the Court of Appeals of Georgia now, 2 out of the 12. And each judge, as I said, has 3 staff attorneys and 1 administrative assistant assisting in the drafting of the opinions. Now, as I said, we have about 3,000 to 3,500 opinions a year, and you divide that by 12, so that means each judge is getting probably 250 to 300 cases a year, depending on the caseload. And I received a report from the clerk's office last week, and other judges got the report too, and it says so far this year, 214 cases have been assigned to each judge on the court. And what we have to do, we have to study the records and issue an opinion. We issue an opinion either affirming what the trial court did or reversing. And sometimes we'll affirm in part and reverse in part, depending on where the error may lie. And the purpose of our court is to correct legal errors. And that's what we are looking for when we study the case. And we, as I said, hear all kinds of appeals. And it's a very, very interesting work. I enjoy studying the law and reading the law, and the kind of people who work at the Court of Appeals, you have to enjoy it or you can't do it, because we, unlike any other state in the nation, have what's called a 2-term rule. That means we have to decide a case within 2 terms after it gets to the court. I talk with appellate judges from other states, and they may have cases pending for a year, 2 years, or 3 years. But you won't have that in Georgia. If you appeal a case in Georgia, you will have an opinion or a decision from the Court of Appeals in probably 8 months, sometimes sooner than that. So you won't have to wait forever to get an opinion. So that's just some background, and we've passed out a chart here today showing you the organization of the courts in Georgia from the bottom to the top. And I'm unique in a way that as a lawyer and as a judge, I've served on every level of court in the state of Georgia. I've practiced law in the lowest courts to the highest courts in the state, on the federal and the state level. And I sat as a judge on every court. I haven't been a full-time judge on every court, but I have sat, for example, filling in when a judge was on vacation or on leave for some reason at some of the courts where I was not serving on a permanent basis. And so that gives me a unique perspective to have had that experience as a lawyer and as a judge. As I said, each of us has a unique background, and each of us has a different journey that led us to whatever we decide to do in life. And in a sense, when I look at my life, injustice is what drove me into the legal profession. And injustice is what determined the kind of lawyer I chose to be. Injustice. And I think you will understand that better when I tell you a little more detail. I grew up in Baker County, deep in southwest Georgia. You know, you know where that is. Some of you are from there too. I spent my early years on a farm that was owned by one of my great-grandfathers. And at the time I grew up in those early years, Baker County was so rigidly segregated that I was, I believe, in the 5th grade before I discovered that white kids went to school. You know, I had been to school about every day and I had never seen one there. And one day I was walking to school along the country road, and a young white boy came by on a scooter, and he offered me a ride. I got on behind him, and he asked where was I going, and I told him I was going to New Salem School. I said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to school too. And I looked at him and I was thinking, you're kind of old to be starting, you know. But I didn't realize that he was going to a different place. And so he dropped me off and went on to a school that I had never seen. And another interesting thing is when I grew up here and finished high school here in Albany, and I decided to go to law school. You know, I began hanging around courthouses, when I was a teenager, watching trials and watching lawyers and judges and how they operate. And when I got to law school, one of the first cases that we studied in constitutional law had originated in Baker County. It was a case called Screws versus the United States, a case involving the lynching of Robert Hall, a black man, by the Baker County Sheriff, Claude Screws, and other law enforcement officers. They arrested him on a pretense, and I made up a warrant after they had arrested him and killed him and dragged him around the courthouse square. And it was such a horrific crime that there was no state prosecution, but there was a federal prosecution. They prosecuted him for a misdemeanor. And in the first trial, the case was so horrible, the facts, that he was convicted. And he appealed, and the others appealed to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court reversed the conviction. And the reason they reversed the conviction was that the judge had not instructed the jury that it could only find him guilty and the others guilty if it found that they acted willfully. And so they ordered a new trial, and they had a new trial. And in the new trial, they were acquitted because the jury found that the government didn't prove that the lynching was intentional. So racially motivated violence was a part of the atmosphere in which I grew up, and it was aggravated by the fact that black folks couldn't turn to law enforcement for any help, because they were a part of the problem, just like I described Screws and his folks. So where could you turn? You had really nowhere to turn. You couldn't turn to the courts because the judges were not going to help you. The state judges weren't going to help you. We had federal courts, and that's why most of the civil rights litigation was in the federal courts. And I had an opportunity to observe C.B. King, Donald Hollowell, and Constance Motley, and others litigating civil rights cases in federal court, in the federal court here in Dougherty County. And that's why the information that I passed out to you shows the organization of the courts, and I also passed out a piece that I wrote a few months ago, and it was published in the magazine of the Young Lawyers of the state of Georgia about judicial temperament. And it shows you what, based on my experience, I think are some of the most important qualities that a judge should have. And when I was growing up, I saw so many who did not have those qualities. When I was going to court as a child, there were no black lawyers, there were no black judges, no black jurors, no black court officials, no black law enforcement officials. And I saw a system in which the parties and the witnesses, if they were black, they were treated with disrespect. I've seen cases tried where the lawyer wouldn't even allow his black client to sit at the table with him during the trial. They'd have to sit over in a corner somewhere. That kind of thing. And I've seen lawyers referring to their clients with using racial slurs and witnesses in that manner. And in those days, no one would speak up. No one would speak up and challenge them when they did that. And ultimately, when C.B. King came back here to practice law in '53, he was the only one who would do that, but he couldn't be everywhere representing everybody at every time. So a lot of it went on, and I often visited his office to discuss the legal profession with him when I was growing up, and would often follow him to court. And talking about courage and judges, one day I followed C.B. King and William Kunstler to court. They were representing some civil rights demonstrators who had been locked up and charged with all kinds of horrific crimes, and they were trying to get these folks out on bond or get the charges dismissed. And I went with them. I sat on the front row, and after all of the evidence was on and the hearing was finished, the judge told the lawyers, C.B. King and William Kunstler and the district attorney, to come to his chambers. I wasn't a lawyer, but I got up and followed them. And when they got in the judge's chambers, the judge said to him, to C.B. King and Mr. Kunstler, he said, "I know that your position is right. And I know that these folks shouldn't be in jail." He said, "But I'm going to rule against you because I have to live in this little town." And he got up and walked back out in the courtroom that was packed, and he announced to everybody that the motions were denied, the cases were not dismissed, and he was not going to set bond. And he did that because he didn't have the courage to do what was right, because doing what was right was not popular in that community. And so those are the kinds of things that led me into the legal profession and led me to go to law school. And I went to Case Western Reserve. At the time C.B. King had gone there, it was Western Reserve. But by the time I got there, they had, I guess, merged it with the engineering school. It was Case Western Reserve, and I applied there because I knew C.B. King. I knew that he had gone there, and I knew of other lawyers that he had told me about, like Fred Gray in Alabama, the one who handled the Tuskegee experiment case, where they were, the syphilis case over there. And I knew about Jim Willis in Cleveland and other civil rights lawyers that he told me about who had gone to school at Case Western Reserve. And so in my mind, Case Western Reserve was a law school where they trained civil rights lawyers. And so that's where I wanted to go. And because I wanted to be the kind of lawyer that they were. And I went there and had a great time and got a great legal education there. And when I came back to Georgia in 1971, I joined the practice of C.B. King. And as many of you know, he did a lot of civil rights litigation and everything from school desegregation, voting rights, police brutality, jury discrimination, public accommodations, students' rights, and all of those things. And I joined him in doing all of those things, not just in Albany, but all over southwest Georgia. We had an exciting practice representing primarily black people, but in those days, whenever a white person had any claim that had any hint of any civil rights thing to do with civil rights, white lawyers wouldn't take it, and they would come to us too. We represented white women in sex discrimination cases. We represented other whites who claimed that they had civil rights violations, such as age discrimination. You know, if it had anything called civil rights, other lawyers wouldn't touch it, and so they would come to us. They would go to them first, but they would end up coming to us because they couldn't find anybody to take their cases. And C.B. King was a great role model because those of you who knew him knew that he was fearless. He was fearless, and he never backed down. And as I mentioned to you earlier about the importance of the record in the appellate court, that's one of the most important things I learned from C.B. King was about the importance of making a good record, because when you go up on appeal, that's all you got, the record that you make. And I learned quickly from C.B. King that we were not going to win the cases in the trial court. You had to win them on appeal if you were going to win them. And the only way you would have a chance to win them on appeal is that you had to make a complete and thorough record. And I've never seen anybody who was better at that than he was. And he wouldn't back down. And a lot of judges would try to intimidate him and push him around. And he was always respectful. And all the time that I practiced with him, I never saw him found in contempt for being disrespectful. He knew how to work within the system and how to make the system work for him. And so a lot of them would have liked to have found him in contempt, but he never gave them that opportunity. And there was a lot of hostility even after I returned. There were many times back in those days when they would have court in rural areas at night because people were on the farms in the daytime. And sometimes they'd have court on the weekends. And sometimes, even if court started in the day, they'd go into the night. I can remember a case where, down in Baker County, where the case went until midnight, because they were just not going to be defeated, and they thought they could wear you down. But he had a lot of stamina, and we would hang in there. And often things were so hostile that black people in the various areas that we would go to would often give us an escort out of town until we had gotten far enough away that they knew that nobody was following us. So those were interesting times. Times have changed a lot since the 40s and 50s because of the work that men like he and Hollowell and Motley and Tom Jackson and Jack Ruffin and Fred Gray and many others have done. Things are a lot better now, but there's still a great need for vigilant lawyers. Vigilant lawyers are essential for a just society. Back in those days when all those wrongs were beating us in the face, we couldn't count on the Georgia legislature to change things. We couldn't count on the governor of Georgia to change things. We couldn't count on Congress to change things. But we did have a chance in the federal courts. And those are the courts where the South was turned around. The Fifth Circuit. At that time we were in the Fifth Circuit. Since then they created the 11th Circuit, and about 1980, and Georgia's in the 11th Circuit now, along with Alabama and Florida. But at that time, we were in the 5th Circuit, and the judges on the 5th Circuit, like one of my heroes is Albert Tuttle, who was the leader of that court for many years. And those are the judges that broke the back of Jim Crow in Georgia, those federal judges. That was long before the Voting Rights Act and Congress had the courage to pass the civil rights litigation in the middle 60s. Long before that, those judges were making decisions that were dismantling that system in the South. They did that because lawyers brought the cases. And lawyers could bring the cases, though, without people like you. And that's why it's important that we have courageous people in every community, like we had in Albany at that time, like we had all over South Georgia at that time, all over the South at that time. There were courageous people who were willing to risk their necks. And I don't have to tell you, a lot of them were killed and injured, lost their jobs and everything else, because they had the courage to do what needed to be done. They had the courage to send their children to schools that had been previously segregated, knowing, what the consequences might be. They had the courage to stand up. They had the courage to go down and insist on being allowed to register to vote. And lawyers make cases. Lawyers have to wait for courageous citizens to go out and try to exercise their rights. And when they are denied those rights, then they go to the lawyers. And that's why lawyers were so important then, and that's why lawyers are so important today, because it's not over. There's still prejudice and discrimination in our nation. People are still mistreated, not only on the basis of race, but also because of gender, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, disability, and other attributes. It was just this week that Augusta National admitted the first women. Just this week, 2012, that they just decided to admit women. And we've got a U.S. Senate candidate who's running around saying that women can't get pregnant when there's a legitimate rape. That kind of thinking is what's the problem. That's kind of thinking is why we need courageous lawyers. And you can still find that justice is being denied to many people on account of many different reasons. And we still need courageous people who will stand up to injustice, whether it's on a small scale or a large scale, whether it's being done by individuals or corporations or government. And you can find it everywhere if you are sensitive enough and you have the courage to point it out. And you can confirm your commitment to justice every time you confront injustice rather than censor your thoughts and your behavior. A great person, or whether it's a great lawyer or a great citizen or even a non-lawyer, must stand up and do not witness injustice and do nothing. Do not witness injustice and do nothing. When I was growing up, you hear people, I heard them then and you hear them now. Well, that's just a few bad apples. You've heard that many times. Well, the Ku Klux Klan was just a few. But the painful thing about the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council and all those folks was that the good people who were in the majority didn't have the courage to stand up. If the good people had had the courage to stand up, those few bad apples would have been pushed aside and shut up and shut down. And they wouldn't have been able to terrorize people and lynch people and do all of the things that they did for so long. One of the most painful things to me was that good people would pull you aside in the corner and say, I don't agree with that. That's not right. But they would never say anything in public. They would never stand up. If they had the courage to stand up and say, that's not right, don't do that, then things would have gotten a lot better a lot sooner than they did. One person can't right every wrong, but you must never underestimate what one committed person can do. and never fail to do what's right. Never let people commit injustice in front of you without letting them know you know what they're doing. You know, you may not be able to outvote them or stop them, but it makes a difference when people know that you know what they're doing, and you have an obligation to tell them. And I've found in my experience it will make a difference. Even though you may be outnumbered, if you have the courage to stand up and let people know that you know that what they're doing is wrong, they will change their behavior. They will back off a little bit. They may not change totally, but they'll back off. And if enough people stand up, you can change them a great deal. And that's why it's so important. It's so important. In order to do that now, you got to be together yourself. You know, you can't stand up if you are compromised personally and professionally. You know, you got to be clean when you stand up and challenge folks. They can't have something to come back on you with. You know, you got to be clean. That's why, you know, C.B. King told me from the beginning, and he used to say all the time, always be on your best professional and personal behavior, because you cannot fight and beg at the same time. So remember that. Remember that. Wherever you are, whatever you are doing, and wherever you find yourself, when you see injustice and you want to stand up to it, you got to be pure yourself, because you can't fight and beg at the same time. And that's why I encourage all the young people here, encourage everybody to stand up. It's not over yet. There's still a lot of work to be done. And we can't always turn our backs and say, well, next generation will take care of that. You know, you're never too old to stand up and speak out for what's right, wherever you are. You know, and the newspaper doesn't have to be there. You know, the television station doesn't have to be there. Wherever you find yourself, whatever group you're in, you have the obligation to stand up and make folks do what's right. And I have, based on, you know, my experience as a judge and a lawyer, being in the courtroom as a judge and a lawyer, since I started in 1971. I became a judge in 1980 on a part-time basis. Judge Russell Malone, who was judge of the State Court of Dougherty County at that time, offered me a part-time position as a magistrate and an associate judge of the State Court here in Dougherty County. And I wasn't interested in being a judge at that time. I wasn't seeking to be a judge, but I took it for one reason. At that time, in 1980, there was not a black judge in the state of Georgia south of Macon. Tom Jackson was a part-time municipal court judge in Macon. But other than that, that was it in the state of Georgia, and that was the reason I took it. You know, we had been doing all that fighting for civil rights and advancement for our people. So when we had an opportunity to get a judge, I didn't think we could turn it down, and C.B. King didn't think we could turn it down. So we had to do it. And I took it, and I enjoyed it, and I'm where I am today because of that initial opportunity that I was given. And as a judge and a lawyer, you're in a great position to help people. You know, that's what a lawyer does. A lawyer helps people, fights for people. You know, I always say that God created lawyers for two reasons. You know, first, so that everybody would have somebody to kick around. And second, so that everybody would have somebody to run to when they start getting kicked around. That's why lawyers were created. And as a judge, you know, you're able to do a lot of good and help a lot of people. And I hope you read what the article that you picked up tonight about judicial temperament. And it talks about how I think a judge should conduct himself or herself. You know, as a judge, one of my principles is this. I always try to treat people better than they deserve. You know, because I'm human too, and I know that they are human, and we make mistakes. All of us do. And I understand that there's just a very thin line between where I'm sitting on the bench and the person out there in front of me. And so I always treat people a little better than they deserve, better than I think they deserve. You know, because that's in order to allow for my failures. You know, human nature being what it is, even judges are not perfect. So that's why I take that approach. And one thing I'd like to say before I close, and it's based on what I've seen over the years as a lawyer and what I'm seeing today as a judge. I think that what we've got to do is rededicate and refocus our efforts on our young people, and from the very youngest up through high school especially. You know, we've got to stop making excuses for people in and out of our community who do things to hinder and hurt our children. But at the same time, we got to tell the truth about what's going on. You know, when I look back over my life, you know, there are two things that stand out. You know, first, I can't remember a time when somebody wasn't describing the problem. You know, I can't remember a time when somebody wasn't whining about what was wrong. And every time I turn on cable now, cable television, you see these panels, they have them every year. These folks get on television, they talk about what's wrong with black folks, what's wrong with poor folks. And you tune in next year and you see those same folks, and they'll be talking about what's wrong with black folks, what's wrong with white folks, what's wrong with poor folks. But you never hear them talk about what they have done since last year to make a difference and to change things. And I'm tired of hearing people whine about what the problem is. I want to hear somebody talk about what they are doing to solve the problem. You know, and I can't remember a time when people weren't making excuses for sorry men who don't support their children. And that's one of the biggest problems that we have in our community. Men who are not supporting their children, and I don't care who doesn't like it. You go down to the courthouse on child support day and see who's there. You know, and you live in the community, you know how many absent fathers there are. And that's a disgrace. You know, children need their mothers and their fathers. Girls need their fathers as much as boys need their fathers. And boys need their mothers as much as girls need their mothers. And we've got to stop making excuses for sorry people who go around getting children and then walk off and leave them. You know, C.B. King used to say they have a dog philosophy of life. You know, if they can't eat it or make love to it, they pee on it and walk off, you know. And that's what we gotta change. That's what we gotta get rid of. And I'm tired of that. You know, I had when I was in juvenile court here in Dougherty County, we saw hundreds and hundreds of cases every year. And it was a rare occasion when a kid came to juvenile court who had the support of both parents. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily the parents are living in the same house. I know people get divorced or they get separated or whatever, but that doesn't mean that both parents can't participate in the raising of that child. You don't have to be under the same roof. And it was a rare occasion when we saw a kid in juvenile court who had the support of both parents. And if you saw one in juvenile court, it was a rare occasion when that kid came back, because those parents would usually straighten out whatever the problem was. You know, I never will forget one day I had a 14-year-old boy who had shot somebody with a shotgun. And his grandmother was trying to raise him, you know. And his grandmother got up and said, "Judge, that boy's dead. He's 14 years old now. His daddy lives in Dougherty County. And he has seen his daddy twice in his lifetime. His daddy's here in Dougherty County." And he said, "Judge, when I was raising my 5 children, their daddy was there to help me. And I was able to do it. He said, and she said, the problem with this boy is that he has never had a man in his life. That was his problem, that she said. And she said that, Judge, things are not going to get better for our children until black men start helping black women raise black children. You know, and we wonder why our children join gangs. Well, we shouldn't be concerned about why they join gangs, because joining a gang is a response to human nature. You know, what's inside you. Everybody wants to be in a family. Everybody wants to belong to somebody. And when the adults don't give them a gang, a family to belong to, they'll find one on the streets. You see, and that's why they join gangs. You know, I grew up in a gang. You know, I had a family. I grew up in a gang. And it was a gang led by J.W. and Marion Phipps, my parents. You know, that's what a family is, a gang. And that's what we need. And so we got to stop blaming our children for joining gangs. We got to start providing them with what they need to keep them from joining the gang. If they had the kind of families they ought to have. And that's what I mean about we got to stop being afraid to tell the truth about what's going on with our children, you know. You know, and somebody asked me the other day whether I believe in homeschooling. Well, I do believe in homeschooling, especially from 3 p.m. to 8 a.m. You know? If children are not homeschooled from 3 p.m. to 8 a.m., it is unrealistic to expect teachers to school them from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. You know, and that's how we're going to solve our problem. We need more homeschooling from 3 p.m. to 8 a.m. You know, and homeschooling is where you teach children manners. You teach them respect for themselves, respect for others, respect for people's property, respect for people's person. You teach them how to dress, you know, not walking around with their breeches dragging the ground. I can't tell you how mad I get every time I'm in a supermarket trying to buy food and somebody's walking showing his drawers all over the place. You know, that shouldn't be allowed, you know. That shouldn't be allowed. You know, I remember one day I was in Helen's barbershop, Helen Young here. Young man came in to get a haircut with his breeches dragging and his drawers showing. Helen told him, don't put your butt on my seat. Don't sit in my chair. You know, you got to pull up your breeches if you're going to come and do business in here. You know, and that's what ought to happen in public places, I think. That people ought to do what she did. She has a small business, but she has some standards for people who come in there. And we got to teach, that's the kind of thing we got to teach our children. I don't care what anybody thinks. You know, we got to stop making excuses for these kids, you know, who walk around like that. You're never going to go anywhere like that. I was on my way to the court in Atlanta the other day, driving down the street, and saw a young man, probably 18 or 20 years old, with his underwear, early in the morning. You know, and I'm thinking, you know, what kind of future does he have? He has no future. You know, whose daughter is he going to marry or get pregnant and not support the children? You know what? He has no future. You know, if that's his attitude, the way he thinks he ought to present himself in public, then he's finished now. He's not going anywhere. You know, we've got to stop talking about, you know, we got to, you know, we hear so many folks, well, that ain't fair. You know, you got to give them a break. They're just expressing themselves, you know, talking about fair. I had a friend who grew up in the country. He had 2 sisters, and his daddy used to make him work in the field all day in the hot sun. The sister stayed around the house with the mother, and he said one day, Daddy, it just ain't fair. All this hard work I have to do, and while the sisters stay in the cool of the house with Mama. And his daddy told him, he said, son, The fair comes once a year for about 3 days. It's been here and gone. So get your butt back out in the field and go to work. So don't talk about what's fair, you know. And just in closing, I want to say one thing. I heard Dr. Robert Franklin, who's the outgoing president of Morehouse College, speak recently, and he said this. He said, from the first day a student arrives at Morehouse College until the last day they are there, the college attempts to instill in the students these 5 traits, and they are these. A Morehouse man should be well-read, well-spoken, well-dressed, well-traveled, and well-balanced. Now, Morehouse doesn't have a copyright on those traits. You know, we can use them. They don't have a copyright. So we ought to apply those everywhere we are, to all of our children. Those are the traits that we ought to be pushing. And I could go on, but I'm going to stop. I've gone on long enough, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you. Thank you.